Good morning, everyone. I'm Kirsten Murphy. I'm the Executive Director for the Vermont Developmental Disabilities Council, and I'm here today to talk about navigating the adult service system. I want to start by sharing that I'm the parent of three young adults, two of whom have forms of autism, and we've had a long and interesting journey. They're 25 and 23 now. One of them just got his first job in his field. He's studying engineering, and he got a lab job for the summer. And the other is about to graduate from college, actually, where he majored in Japanese. I don't know how he's going to support himself with that, but these were young people. These were kids that had intensive special education supports and even spent some time in out-of-district placements. And yet they're doing great. So one of the messages you'll hear me talking about a lot today is just dream big, and you don't always know where you're going. Let's see if I can just navigate these buttons a little bit. Okay. Can you close that? Great. Okay. So getting started. First off, this is a huge topic, and any one of the services that I mentioned today is probably worth its own presentation. So at best, I can give you a big picture and a way to think about the kind of awesome project of setting up services that are appropriate for your son or daughter as they enter adulthood. There will be certain kind of foundational assumptions that I make that I want to disclose up front. First off, even if you have a very young child, I think this presentation is important. I think you need to know where you're going, even from a very early part of your journey, parenting somebody with a disability. So transition, as far as I'm concerned, the big T transition, the transition to adulthood, begins the day your son or daughter is born, and is framed by the kinds of expectations that you bring to the project. I always coach families on having very high expectations, because you don't harm anyone by doing that, and having low expectations runs the risk of really overlooking services or supports or opportunities that your child might have benefited from. Another assumption that I think is pretty important, and none of our service systems really reflect this, is the fact that we now know brain development doesn't end at 18. There's not a magic date at which your brain stops developing. In fact, there's a burst of brain development in the early 20s that can be very influential in helping folks to develop sort of those pre-employment skills, things like getting to things on time and planning and that sort of thing. So you don't know based on behavior at 15 what that might look like at 24. You don't know that for a child with typical development. You don't know that for a child with atypical development. So today's learning objectives, I'm going to be giving you a map, not detailed instructions. We will talk about some different types of services and the eligibility rules that apply to them. Along the way, I will stress the difference between services that are an entitlement and services that are optional. I'll tell you right up front, the bad news is that you have a lot of entitlements. Your son and daughter has a lot of entitlements under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And there are fewer entitlements for adults. So that is part of the trick of arranging an appropriate array of supports. I will try very hard to notice if any clarifying questions pop up on the screen here, as Janice said, and address them as I'm talking. I will try to make sure that we have time for bigger questions at the end. I also have peppered the talk with some sort of myths and assumptions that I want to try to lay to rest while we go through this. So, what is that strange new land ahead? Adulthood. I use a version of this graph all the time when I'm coaching families. I used to do a lot more of one-on-one family support work. And what I want to stress is that rather than thinking about a specific service, how do I get my child into developmental services? Or, I got to think about Social Security next. You start by thinking about what it is that you want your child, your son or daughter, to be doing when they're an adult. What parts of their life are you trying to configure? And then we kind of backward engineer the services into that. This helps you think outside of the box. It helps you get out of some of the categorical tricks that the service system plays on us, where you kind of start planning around meeting a set of eligibility criteria rather than thinking about, well, what do I want? What should life look like at 23? So this talk is structured around 5. I could probably have different terms for these or parse these in a different way, but 5 basic parts of life that any young adult is thinking about. Self-support, which has to do with how are you going to meet your basic needs, who your community is and how you interact with it, how you take care of yourself in terms of health and wellness, ongoing personal development, whether that's education or more of a kind of spiritual development, all the things that go into continuing to grow long after high school graduation, and self-determination, how you have some choice and control in your life. We're going to start at the top with self-support, meeting basic needs. So one of the things that you'll start thinking about and probably worrying about is, how will my son or daughter be able to buy food or go to the movies or have enough money to pay rent if they're not continuing to live with me? All those sorts of things. And most adults with disabilities are in fact blending more than one type of funding into a set of funding streams that kind of work together to support them. So employment is the number one reason that we go to school, and it's the number one thing that adults define themselves by in our culture. And employment is something that we really stress beginning to plan for, beginning to think about as early as possible. We do that with typically developing children. What do you want to be when you grow up, right? And the answer might not be terribly realistic, or it might change over time. I'm speaking as a parent of a ballerina, my 3rd child, so it's a conversation to begin having and to begin to think about some of the basic skills that go into employment, not the specific job, but the skills that go into getting to work on time, having a work ethic, being appropriate when you're talking to an authority figure who could be your boss. We'll come back and talk a bit more about various forms of employment, but there's a requirement now under a law called the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which it's a Department of Labor rule, that is really forcing high schools to begin bringing vocational rehabilitation and their services to the table for transition planning as early as the age of 14. So I strongly encourage getting to know what vocational rehabilitation can do, and you have the opportunity to do that in your IEP meetings. And you should, really push your case manager to make sure that you have VR attend, periodically. There's funding, even Vermont's VR, which just experienced some pretty drastic funding cuts, about $5 million really. Still, there is the opportunity to pay for some very creative supports through VR in ways that they couldn't otherwise be paid for. Most people with a significant disability or serious chronic illness or condition will tap into SSI or SSDI, the Social Security Insurance or Social Security Disability Insurance. That can begin as early as 18, and enrollment will be based on a combination of need and financial need. People make a good deal out of maximizing your SSI benefit. But I'm here to tell you it's not exactly an elegant lifestyle. It's $787 a month currently, both federal and state sources, which is a monthly income well below the poverty level. However, it is a basic form of assistance, and one of the ironies of SSI is when you go to apply, you're basically telling in this case, the federal government, hey, I can't work. I have some condition that means I can't work. And you're kind of signing away and saying that. And yet at the same time, even Social Security is smart enough to know that they don't want people to be completely dependent on Social Security, and they don't want people to not work. There are tremendous social and personal development benefits that come with working, as well as the income. So I'm gonna turn here now to a kind of a myth-busting exercise that I want to do with you. The myth that you'll hear a lot is, if you work, you will lose your benefits, and you will hear that, and you'll hear that even from case managers in special education. You'll hear that quite a lot. The truth is that that's only partially correct. Most publicly funded benefits are means tested and income sensitive. That means they will look at your means or assets, your son or daughter's assets, those things that are in their name. And they also often have a kind of sliding scale that reflects what other income sources that individual might have. The bottom line is someone will always do better by working than just collecting Social Security, and they will always do better by working more than if that's something that they can do, even if it means reducing that part of their supports that is coming from Social Security insurance. So let's take my friend Mike here. Mike works at Tire Warehouse, which he really enjoys. He does a lot of inventory there. This is a completely made-up example, by the way. He works 5 hours a week at $10 an hour, and he earns $200 a month. That's a pretty typical level of a job for someone who's had significant special education supports and is probably served in some way by the Developmental Services system. 5 hours is probably a little on the high end, actually, and $10 an hour is pretty good. And Mike gets some Social Security income, and there's a formula that Social Security uses that kind of reflects a dampening down of their obligation, and as you increase the amount of time that you are getting paid for your employment. So the bottom line for Mike is that along with his Social Security and his $200 a month, he's making $929.50 a month. Now that's still below the poverty level. But Mike has a problem. Mike really wants to save some money because it's something he wants to do. In my made-up story, Mike wants to take a class because he's also an amateur metal worker, metal sculptor. And his parents won't let him play with any of the fun power tools that he'd like to have access to unless he takes a formal class and learns how to use a soldering iron. So Mike's figured out that he can sign up for this at his local recreation center and learn how to use the soldering iron and other cool tools. That he's actually pretty successful with some of his sculptures. He sells them at farmers markets periodically, and it's a source of income for him. Well, how is Mike going to get the $180 he needs to pay for the class? And even more, how is he going to pay for a support worker to come with him? Because his parents have said, no power tools unless you bring somebody with you. So Mike sits down with his case manager and he thinks about it and figures it out, and he raises his number of hours to 8 hours a week. Okay, so now he's making $320 a month. It is true that that reduced his Social Security income. That went down to $669. but his combined income is still higher. It's $989, right? So he's getting ahead by working more, all right? In fact, in 3 months, that's enough to have saved up the $180 he needs. Now, there was another problem for Mike, however. Oops, wrong button. Okay, so the other problem that Mike has, though, is that his grandmother kindly gives him some Christmas gifts, and he has a savings account in his name, in his own name, that's just shy of $2,000. It's floating around $1,900. Well, guess what? Social Security, up until recently, would not allow a recipient to have more than $2,000 in their name, or their Social Security would stop until they got back down under $2,000. So you could not have an asset in your own name and beyond $2,000, and that number has not changed in many, many years. It hasn't been adjusted for inflation or anything. Or else you run the risk of not only losing your Social Security, but having to redo all the paperwork that set it up in the first place. That's what's called a means-tested benefit. It looks at your asset. Never mind about his income. It's what he owns, what kind of property he has, and in this case, it's the cash that he has in a savings account. Good news for folks, and there's a webinar that I gave on this subject that's been archived that you can get more details on, but ABLE savings accounts have recently come online. This is a really game-changing new opportunity for people with disabilities to have money in a special account that is in their own name. It's not in a special needs trust. And it is, by federal law, not allowed to be counted when any means-tested federal benefit is determining your eligibility. In other words, Social Security can't count the $1,900 that Mike has if he cleverly moves it immediately to an ABLE account. There's a lot of, not a lot, but there's a handful of restrictions and complexities to ABLE. Vermont recently announced its own branded version of this. We partnered with the state of Ohio to create Vermont ABLE. Our state treasurer, Beth Pierce, and the DD Council worked together to select what we thought was the best possible vendor, the most user-friendly, the most disability-sensitive organization, and that was the Ohio program. And you can go to the website listed there. You'll see the same link at the end of this presentation to learn more about it. But quickly, you can save up to $14,000 a year and have that same rule apply. The savings will not be counted against either your Medicaid, which we'll discuss in a minute, or your Social Security. These are investment accounts. They come with a small tax advantage. You will, of course, pay income tax on the money you put in, whether it's a parent putting money in or the individual who's working. But the investment, as it earns money, that interest is tax advantaged. It's not taxed at the federal or state level. And money can be drawn out for an incredibly wide range of qualified disability expenses. Essentially everything except lottery tickets, adult entertainment, and liquor are legitimate qualified disability expenses. It's very hard for me to think of many things that don't qualify. Basic support like paying your rent or even buying food are considered qualified disability expenses. One of the reasons that we chose this particular program is that it comes with what's called a preloaded debit card, a little plastic card. Works more like a gift card than a debit card. I know my debit card is a little bit of a danger for me to carry around, because if I don't pay attention, I could use my debit card to empty my account. And understandably, people who don't have strong financial literacy skills might not want to have full access to all of their money at all times. But a fixed amount of money can be put on this preloaded debit card and used pretty much anywhere except certain blocked types of vendors, which are essentially adult entertainment and gambling. That card can only be used to draw down the fixed amount. So Mike could put $60 a month onto his ABLE That's called the stable card onto his ABLE account, preloaded debit card, and use that to pay a worker who comes with him to his metalworking class, for example. So ABLE is really a game changer. It is, we think, going to be used primarily by two groups: families that want to plan ahead and save for a son or daughter that they think will have a significant disability into adulthood. It also is an incredible support for working adults with disabilities. So kind of putting the pieces together, this is not an unusual arrangement and just meeting your basic needs. So Mike here, you know, he has his SSI income, he has his work income, and he draws down a small amount from, say, an ABLE account. And to wrap that out, we don't have time to talk about a few other basic need type benefits, but many people with disabilities do indeed live below the poverty level and are therefore eligible for housing, subsidized housing through the through HUD. There are usually waiting lists involved. Food stamps and fuel assistance and some of the other poverty programs that you can learn about. Oddly, on the Agency of Human Services website, they're listed on, you would look under economic services, and they're actually listed under the Department of Children and Families. Again, this is a pretty typical arrangement for somebody to meet their basic needs. Okay, well that's all great, but what about all the extra things that somebody might need because they have a significant disability? And without support, they're not able to interact effectively with their community, with their neighbors, with their friends, do basic things like shopping, getting around. So DLTSS is one of those acronyms we're always using. It stands for Disability Long-Term Services and Supports. Here's where we get to talk about my personal favorite topic, Medicaid. Medicaid is a huge program, and it's really incredible what the Medicaid program does. Unfortunately, our governor was recently quoted saying, "Oh, Medicaid, yeah, it's just a form of insurance. It's just health insurance." No, it is not just a form of health insurance. There are many, I always say Medicaid comes in two flavors. Medicaid is health insurance. That's one Medicaid program, sometimes referred to as state plan Medicaid. But it also pays for many things that no health insurance company pays for. And these would be the kinds of supports that a person might need in the community. For folks, adults with disabilities, that will fall under two programs, Vermont's Developmental Disabilities Services and the Choices for Care program. So I'm going to just try to compare and contrast a tiny bit between those two. How do you qualify? Well, your point of entry for developmental services is the designated agency in your county. So every county has what's called a designated state agency, and it has most have both community mental health and developmental services. And your first stop to see if you are going to access these types of services is to call that agency, and they have their way of doing an assessment. In the Choices for Care program, which I'll kind of explain a little bit more later, you're really interfacing directly with the department, or alternatively you can go to your area agency on aging or your regional Agency of Human Services office, which is the same place you would go for food stamps, for example. So what's the difference between these two programs? This is where Vermont is really quite unusual. Vermont has a law, it's called its State DD Act, that defines developmental disability in a very narrow way. Now, this isn't what they mean, like, this isn't how developmental disability is defined in general. This is a definition specifically for the purposes of accessing services. And the state of Vermont defines a developmental disability for the purposes of services as having an IQ of 70 or below. There's a small window of statistical error around that, or an autism spectrum disorder that impacts two areas of daily functioning, 2 standard deviations below the norm. So really, unless you have what is sometimes referred to as an intellectual disability or autism, one of the autisms, you are not eligible for developmental services. I don't know many states that do that. For example, if you have cerebral palsy in the state of New Hampshire, you have a developmental disability. It's something that started early in life, and you access the developmental services system as an adult if that's something you need. If you cross the Connecticut River into Vermont, magically you no longer have a developmental disability because it isn't defined that way in Vermont law. You might be eligible for this other program, Choices for Care, which we'll get to in a minute. The other thing I want to point out about developmental services is there's two gates. The first gate is to get actually the designation that you have a developmental disability and therefore qualify for Medicaid by this definition. In addition, Vermont uses a tool called the System of Care. It's a plan that's written every 3 years, and that System of Care sets out the priority situations that are going to receive funding for community-based support, or 6. They tend to be very crisis-driven, and over the years they have grown narrower. So imagine that somebody has, full disclosure, I don't really think IQ is a particularly meaningful number, but it is how the state thinks of these things. So Susie has an IQ of 69, so she gets through the first gate. But then what has to be proved in her eligibility assessment is that she meets one of the 6 categories of priority. And I probably can't tick all of them off, but most of them are very crisis oriented. She is at risk for homelessness. That would be one. She is herself a parent. She has a risk of safety risk to herself or to others. That's the one that most people try to get into the service system through. And the only one that's not very crisis driven is one that's been expanded some in the last few years, which is if she's graduating from high school and has a job or gets a job before the age of 26, then she's considered to be at risk of losing that job, and therefore developmental services will find her eligible, probably with a package that emphasizes employment supports. I'm going to show you some numbers in a minute, but if you thought that was a pretty narrow window, you're right. There are many, the vast majority of Vermonters who were, for example, identified with a developmental disability and had extensive special education supports. The vast majority of them will not, in fact, qualify for adult services. That doesn't mean they might qualify for SSI. There might be other parts of support, vocational rehab, that they tap into, but this specific Medicaid service, they don't qualify. The Choices for Care program is the program that is mostly accessed by adults who have a physical type of disability. And that physical disability needs to be extensive or total, and you need extensive or total assistance with at least one activity of daily living. ADL is an activity of daily living. And then you would be ruled into what they call the high need category. Thing to know about the Choices for Care program is it was created specifically for seniors. The average amount of time that someone is enrolled in the Choices for Care program is about a little over a year, because folks die typically when they're in Choices for Care. And there's this kind of poorly fit group of about 700 Vermont adults who have a physical disability and significant needs, who are also served by Choices for Care. Because it's a program designed specifically for seniors and not for adults, one of the things that is not offered on the menu of Choices for Care is any form of employment support. So if you needed support in order to just be physically at your job site, for example, if you needed assistance toileting, you could not get that if you were served through the Choices for Care program. This is not every service available through the 2 programs, nor did I give you the average number, the average dollar amount for packages, because that seems to go down every year. But this is a list of the main services, the community-based services that folks could access if they were lucky enough to get into one of these two programs. Lucky enough meaning they also had significant need. In developmental services, it might be direct support provider, somebody that helps you in the community and with your shopping or just, getting to and from places. You may also qualify for a program called Enhanced Family Care. This is a model Vermont has relied on very heavily. I think most people probably know that Vermont does not have an institution, does not put people in institutions. Many states do still put people in institutions, but Vermont closed its institution more than 20 years ago. So everyone is served in the community. Well, the question when people were first coming out of what was called the Brandon Training School, was the state institution, was, well, these were often people whose families had frankly abandoned them. These were adults, even fairly older adults, who didn't have a family to go home to in the community. And they had a disability significant enough that they were not going to be living independently. And enhanced family care is the closest analogy would be as kind of an adult foster care model. So an individual will live with sometimes it's a family, and that family becomes responsible for providing some of their direct support and coordinating some of their services. It was a great model at the time Brandon closed, and but it may need some updating now. I might need to think a little bit differently about it. I know myself as a parent, the first reaction I have is I wouldn't want my kid living with some other family. He has a family. I'm his family. That's not, I wouldn't do that. But people can also use this model where somebody might live with an age peer, and that age peer provides them some support. So it looks a little bit more like being, I don't know, living in a college, near a college, and your buddy and you have an apartment or something like that. Enhanced family care is still very much accessed. Vermont only has a tiny number of group homes, which is the other model that a lot of states use, and I think the maximum amount that people can be congregated is 3 in Vermont. It's pretty low. I would have to check that fact to confirm it. The other things on the menu: supported employment, assistance at your job, case management, emergency services, and respite, which is something that families often use if their adult son or daughter lives with them. In the Choices for Care program, that one-on-one personal care maxes out at 4.5 hours a week, which is a lot less than you would have received in developmental services. Some of the people in this program also need skilled nursing and home visiting nurses. Companion services, again, this is a model for seniors that's being retrofitted for adults with disabilities. So that is exactly what it sounds like, someone to come keep you company. I was talking to someone recently served through this program, and he uses the companion service to have a buddy come with him, and they like to go to music concerts at Common Ground. That's the place, right? It's Common Ground, yeah. Because this guy also volunteers there, and he gets some free tickets, and he uses his companion to go to concerts. That's a very creative use of it, but it's essentially it's kind of an odd fit for a younger adult. Case management, respite, emergency services. Okay, so myth number 2, a child with significant special education services will qualify for disability long-term services and support. Wrong. The truth is about 18% of adult Vermonters with developmental disabilities, as defined in Vermont's very restricted way, will qualify for disability long-term services and supports. The other 82% that met that definition of having an IQ of 70 or below or autism with some conditions on it, the other 82% do not qualify, or they may qualify for case management only, which is only about an hour a week. So just to put some hard numbers on this, The federal definition of a developmental disability is actually very broad. The federal government defines it quite broadly, and it has a prevalence rate with their definition of around 86,000 in the state of Vermont, if you compute that. Now, obviously, many people within that 86,000 have tons of skills, don't necessarily need lots of support. If we then move to Vermont's state definition, well, the number drops to around 11,000, right? And then if we look at the percent of Vermonters that actually qualify for either developmental services or choices for care, it drops down to a very tiny number of hours. You see there, adding them up, it's about 3,617 people, or roughly about 4.1% of people who met the federal definition. Self-care. And I'm going to be moving through these a little faster because I've talked about some of the major programs now. I did mention that Medicaid, right, it is, one thing it is health insurance, and most people with significant disabilities and health conditions do have Medicaid as their primary form of insurance. The bad news is, while Medicaid for children is an extremely strong program with a lot of protections and entitlements, Medicaid for adults is not that strong. It's not great insurance. It's great insurance for kids because the entitlements are very broad for children. But once you age beyond, I can't remember if it's 18 or 21, and you move into the adult Medicaid system, you aren't, for example, entitled. Dental is an optional service, and in fact, in Vermont, I think there's a cap on dental of around $400 to $500. Vermont's considered progressive in that it gives adults any dental. I'm going to want to talk to you about a little bit more about some of the often overlooked issues around healthcare and health and wellness for adults. So myth number 3, people with developmental disabilities don't, and now we're going to insert any routine screening you can think of, pap smear, breast exam, prostate exam. The truth is, adults with disabilities face significant health disparities. In fact, people with adults have significantly higher rates of chronic disease. They have more risk factors, and these are risk factors that have nothing to do with their disability. These are things that are usually a function of lifestyle choices. And they, in fact, report very poor quality interactions with adult care providers in the healthcare system. Our council did a long white paper on this subject in collaboration with Green Mountain Self-Advocates. I could talk a lot about all the statistics, but here I'm just going to share some from Special Olympics because they're a good way to introduce you to the topic. This is national data from Special Olympics, which is now the world's largest public health organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. They do a lot of health screenings, a lot of health promotion. Let's remember that the people who go to Special Olympics are usually pretty motivated. They want to exercise. They want to be in there doing some kind of physical activity, and they have enough supports in their life to get there. Okay, so this is kind of the elite of folks with developmental disabilities. In a team of 10 athletes, 6 of them will be obese or overweight. 4 have obvious tooth decay, and 1 needs an urgent referral to the dentist. 3 will fail their hearing screening. 4 need glasses, and 2 have active eye disease. And 5 have significant problems with flexibility. 4 will have significant problems with balance. Those numbers are not different in Vermont. It's easier to, the pool of data is a lot bigger nationally, but Vermont does track this stuff, and it's really not significantly different. So why are people with disabilities medically underserved? This was the topic of as I said, of a white paper we put together, but simple fact is it's for a good reason. People with disabilities live long into adulthood, and they didn't a decade or 2 ago, right, or 3. The life expectancy has rapidly increased for people with even the most significant disabilities. So while training to work with folks with developmental disabilities was once considered to be a pediatric issue, It no longer is, but medical schools have not caught up with that fact. So if you talk to physicians and nurses and other types of healthcare providers, they are in fact very anxious about working with adults, especially two types of disabilities, any form of sort of complex or multiple disability configuration, and people who use alternative forms of communication. They really don't feel that they have the training. They're very anxious about it. They don't feel they know how to do it. So there are many adult providers that just don't feel that they're competent to work with this particular population. So it's a critical need that it's taken our country and Vermont a little too long to catch up to. There are also still a lot of bias and cultural myths. And then there are many barriers that are simply a lack of enforcing ADA standards. And I can assure you that's true in Vermont. The number of smaller clinics that have a wheelchair accessible scale is tiny, and that's just a violation of the law. I just put this picture in here to show you some of the things that you might think about as you plan for a transition in healthcare. It is maximizing a person's independence as an adult to be able to express what they need in a health setting. And there are lots of tools out there, and I'll give you the link for this one at the end of the talk. This is called My Health Passport, and it's a great document that somebody can use, have with them, say they show up in an emergency room and they really aren't, it's not a skill set for them to tick off all of their medications or past surgeries and other things. So there's lots of tools out there that can help support someone to be able to express what they need in medical settings. I said I wanted to say a little bit about the fact that people don't stop learning when they graduate from high school. Imagine that. I'm certainly learning all the time. Vermont is lucky. We have 3 programs that use the facilities of colleges in our state to give somebody with a significant disability a college-like experience. They're not degree granting, but there are 3. Think college, college steps, and succeed. ABLE, again, I'm just going to throw out there, one of the primary ways it might be used is to save for some kind of post-secondary vocational training or experience like some of these college-based programs. Self-advocacy is very strong in Vermont, and I can't say enough to urge people to get to know your local self-advocacy organization. Again, I'll give you a link to do that, but it really, peers help peers learn how to speak up for themselves. And Green Mountain Self-Advocates is our statewide organization. There are more than 20 chapters now, so there's undoubtedly one in your county. It's really a good way for young people to begin to take some ownership about the planning for their adult life. HMSA has been doing some outreach to high schools, and it's been incredibly successful. And then I'm just going to say again, maximize transition services while you have an IEP. Do not let your IEP team tell you that there's a finite, oh, well, we can't do that, or, transition services at our high school are, and then they give you a very kind of prescribed package. There's a lot of creative ways to use the transition requirements in the IEP process to access dual enrollment, say with a community college, to access opportunities that allow somebody to experiment in employment. Project Search is a great opportunity for folks to try a variety of jobs typically in a hospital campus in the last year of their special education services, and often to graduate with a job. So just push your team to offer you the things that are going to get you to supporting the functions you want to see in your son or daughter's life. Myth number 4, she'll never, he'll never. So I just put that in to remind us that, again, we don't know just based on what someone can do and when they're 15, what they can or can't do when they're 25 or 35 for that matter. I mean, there's always the possibility for growth. Self-determination, that's a kind of a mouthful. It's a little bit of a jargony term in disability rights, but Self-determination, I have added here because of Vermont's heightened awareness now that folks with significant disabilities even should not automatically be put into guardianship. And we suspect it's largely schools that sit the family down because they're actually required by law to tell you, when he turns 18, he doesn't have to let you come to this meeting. You better get guardianship. And families run off to the probate court, and maybe that is or isn't appropriate, but they aren't aware that there are a wide range of other options. This is my slide to talk about the dignity of risk, which is a concept that simply says everybody has a right to make a mistake. And guardianship and some of these issues are a way to sort of protect your loved one, and it's understandable, but just like the rest of us, they have a right to make a mistake, and hopefully it's not going to involve burning logs. This is my son Josh. He has typical autism. He's studying engineering now at a state university out west, and he's very fond of Spartan races. So this is Josh's version of risk. I'm glad I didn't know he was going to do this. He's jumping over flaming logs, right? So myth number 5, you need to get guardianship at 18 or else ... There are lots of halfway measures. There's something called shared decision making, where an individual can identify who's going to help them with what types of decisions. There are limited forms of powers, such as a power of attorney specifically for health care, or a power of attorney specifically for financial decisions. So I would encourage folks to read up a little bit on the range of options for supporting somebody as they begin to make decisions for themselves. So I wanted to give you just a handful of resources so that you would know where to look when you went back and said, I heard about this thing about Social Security, and you're allowed to work and still get Social Security. So that's a resource. It's called the Red Book, and that will tell you everything you need to know about work incentives within the Social Security program. I mentioned the System of Care Plan, which is kind of the driver for who gets what in developmental services. This is the link for the current one. Not quite sure why that just came up. There's the link for the Vermont Able Savings Program. And it is frozen. There's only 2 more slides. Okay. There's our link for the self-advocacy organization I mentioned, Green Mountain Self-Advocates. They have an annual conference called Voices and Choices. Great way for a young person to learn about self-advocacy just in a short 6-hour visit to a conference in Burlington. Healthcare transitions, I wanted you to know about the Got Transition website, and also where to get a copy of that health passport. And then the Center for Supported Decision Making is a place where you can read up about some alternatives to full guardianship. So, final thoughts. Start the conversation early with your son or daughter. Keep asking yourself, have I maximized my special education services? Your son or daughter will never have an entitlement that broad again. This is a marathon, so take it slow. And remember, it's not about the plan. What you're looking for is a full life, right? You want a better life for your son or daughter, not a better plan. And we do still have a few minutes for questions, and I have my contact information. Okay. So, yes. I'm sure a lot of people have this question on their mind. I've jumped to it because it's only 3 lines long. The Trump administration's proposed budget has big cuts to Medicaid. What would this mean for Vermont? I'm a parent, and what can I do? Well, of course, we have some pretty progressive congressional representatives here. I know that they are, all 3 of them, going to fight really hard to preserve the safety net programs like Medicaid. But it's potentially very bad news for Vermont. Vermont already kind of uses, you'll have to take my word for this, something called a block grant around its Medicaid, but we are apt to have a smaller block. And that would be very bad news in a state that has pretty broad eligibility for folks. We expanded Medicaid for as a form of insurance. So we are likely to find things very, very difficult. What can you do? Please contact Sanders' office, Welch's office, Leahy's office. And what they want are stories. They want to know what Medicaid means for your family. And just a few sentences, don't go on at length, but they need those stories because they use them in their testimony and when they're trying to convince their peers. So if you have a good story about what Medicaid means for you, please share it with your congressional reps. So another question, I'm a parent of a young adult with a disability and I would like to get more involved in advocating for systems change. Where do I start? Any training I can attend? Funny you should ask. We have a great program that we'll be recruiting for soon. It's called the Vermont Leadership Series. You can learn about it on, certainly on the Vermont Developmental Disability Council website. You just Google on Vermont Developmental Disability Council and you'll find our website, and that's certainly a place where you'll see the applications posted. It's a training series that takes place over a course of 3 weekends, and it's a great way to start moving into more advocacy, not only for your son or daughter, but for changing whole systems. Plus you'll meet a lot of really fellow participants that are just really exciting people. A lot of great relationships get built in that program. Family Network, you have to be nominated for the program, so Family Network takes responsibility for nominating parents. So they'll be sort of reviewing your application if you'd like to get involved. And both Janice, who spoke earlier, and myself are involved with planning that program. Let's see, how does Vermont's GD services and choices for care compare to other states? It seems like people move to Vermont to get more and better services. What are my thoughts about that? Well, full disclosure, I actually raised my family in New Hampshire on the other side of the river. And we often think of that as a state that doesn't give people much. It's one of those states you might want to move away from if you were trying to improve your services. Bottom line is I got much better services for my son, the one you saw jumping over the flames there. He had a full waivered package of community-based supports in adolescence and childhood. And Vermont doesn't have a program like that. Frankly, adults get better packages in New Hampshire than they do in Vermont. What's different, however, is that you might sit on a waiting list. Vermont doesn't have a waiting list, but most states have waiting lists, and many states have egregiously long waiting lists. So someone might graduate from high school and then spend 5 years with no support because they're on a waiting list in Georgia. That's very common. Vermont manages to the money. We don't have a waiting list in part because we don't keep one. Every year we manage the eligibility criteria in order to make sure that there's enough money to match the people who the state has determined are in fact eligible. Medicaid nerds like myself call it the golden triangle. There's only really 3 things you can manipulate in Medicaid funded services. Who gets the service, what's the rate the provider is paid, and what services are covered. And you can constrain or tighten one of those 3 points of the triangle to try to, match your state's priorities. I would say that in Vermont, they've constrained eligibility and rates a great deal, but they tend to offer a broader array of services than most other states. But in the end, it's still a finite pool of funding. Another question. Where can I read Vermont? Let's see. I've heard that age 19 for a youth who is no longer in school is a hard time to get services. What would your advice be to parents and youth? Well, I think you've heard me say it again. If you can help your now independent adult who's turned 18 to understand that it is not necessarily in his or her interest to graduate from high school, but to max out the services they can get until they turn 22, by all means do that. You're going to have far better entitlements. They don't have to, they may feel that they're too old to go to high school. That's fine. They can still access special education services but not physically go to high school. That can be opportunities for trying jobs, opportunities like Project Search, like I mentioned. So really, I would counsel folks to try not to get out of special education too early, because you're right, 19 can be really hard because you haven't taken advantage of some of the sports, and because, like I showed you before, not a lot of people get services. So you're taking a big risk to take your degree. I think, yes, we have one last question here. Somebody asked, what resources are you aware of for assistive technology funding? That's one of the areas where, unfortunately, they've narrowed support for that. That used to be easily embedded in the system of care plan and developmental services, and it no longer is. There's not a line for goods, tangible objects like a communication board or a wheelchair, that kind of thing. So there is something called flexible funding that is annually kind of put back into the developmental services system. Sometimes people use that for assistive technology. It is an eligible expense through an ABLE account, but again, that is your own money. It's not, again, this is, if you still have an IEP, then they got to pay for it, right? So again, another reason to not necessarily let the school push you out. I'm noticing somebody writing in a question, schools are trying to push out, required to meet grad requirements and then work on transition services. Any recommendations? I'm not an expert on education rules. But I would really recommend calling Vermont Family Network, and Karen Price and some of the good people here can help you with that. I do know from one of our council members who works for the Department of Education that this is not what the department wants to see. And this is a misunderstanding about these graduation requirements. So it is really important that you get the detail from an expert here at Family Network. I'm noticing our time is 11 now, and I don't want to keep people. You do have my contact information, so I always welcome people getting in touch and try to be as attentive as I can, even when I'm juggling a bunch of things. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Please visit VFN's website at Vermont Family Network, all one word, .org, for helpful resources, upcoming webinars, and other workshops and events. This webinar will be archived along with all of our other webinars and can be viewed on Vermont Family Network's YouTube channel. I do encourage you to try to take a look at the one on ABLE if that interested you. It was a little before we announced the program, but it's got quite accurate information. If you'd like to talk with someone at VFN, for example, the woman who just wrote in about schools, please call 1-800-800-4005 and have a great day. Thanks.